Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for coming. I am honored to be the moderator of this panel, which is a very important topic on geoengineering governance. As the opportunity to reduce greenhouse gases slowly slips away from us, the importance of geoengineering adaptation has to rise. And I say that with great trepidation, and I dare say that our panelists will also have that trepidation, because it's really not a solution to global warming, but really as a measure of last resort. So we are fortunate here to have some of the leading scholars on geoengineering. First, we're going to hear from Professor Al Lin. He's a professor of law at the University of California, Davis School of Law. Professor Lin has written extensively on the subject of geoengineering, and will be providing an overview on geoengineering and the ways in which to govern its potential use or to combat its the worst effects of climate change. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Will Burns, who's the director of the Energy Policy and Climate Program at the Johns Hopkins University. Professor Burns is also the editor of a forthcoming book on the subject, Geoengineering the Climate, Geoengineering the Climate, Law, Ethics, and Policy Considerations. And actually, Professor Lin is contributing a chapter to that book. So the collaboration at this panel has begun far, far ago. Professor Burns will address geoengineering through a specific governance framework, that of human rights, international human rights law. Last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Professor Jonathan Vescuren and Professor Florka, of Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Professor Vescuren and Professor Florka will place geoengineering really in a larger context, and that is geoengineering in the context of technology, and how technology could influence and address the need for or shape of regulations and laws. Really the other side of the coin of what Professor Burns and Professor Lin will do. Put differently, they will address how technology could influence and shape the laws rather than how law will manage technology, and use geoengineering as an example. So without further ado, I give you Professor Lin. Let's please give him a nice warm welcome.
All right, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Today I will be discussing designing a geoengineering governance regime. This is a chapter of a book project in which I argue for reorienting how our legal institutions handle emerging technologies. Traditionally, government has promoted technological innovation by providing research funding, intellectual property protection, and other forms of support. Attention to adverse effects tends to come much later, if at all. And I think there are two fundamental flaws with this approach. Number one, it fails to consider in a timely manner the adverse effects and uncertainties of emerging technologies. And two, it lacks meaningful public input in the development and use of these technologies that broadly and deeply affect our lives. The bottom line of the book, essentially, is that our laws and institutions must be more forward-looking and seek to anticipate future technological developments as well as adverse effects while trying to plan for uncertainty. Our laws also should provide more information about technological risks and allow citizens technology management decisions. The book contains case studies of various emerging technologies, including nanotechnology and synthetic biology. Geoengineering provides an interesting case study because it particularly raises technology governance issues in an international context. So what exactly is geoengineering? Geoengineering is basically a catch-all term for various technologies to thwart the climatic consequences of higher concentrations of atmospheric greenhouse gases. We can contrast geoengineering with the two main policy options that we hear about, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, of course, focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation focuses on adapting to a world with a changed climate. And as we all know, we haven't been able to accomplish a whole lot with respect to mitigation or adaptation. And so that's led to increased attention to geoengineering as an alternative, though potentially problematic approach. Examples of geoengineering proposals include fertilizing the oceans with iron or other micronutrients to stimulate algae growth, seeding marine clouds to increase their reflectiveness or increase cloud cover, and deploying sulfur particles in the stratosphere to deflect the sun's radiations. These various proposals fall into two basic categories: carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management. The removal of carbon dioxide would move greenhouse gas concentrations back toward their natural state, and that would presumably help to restore the Earth's climate system toward earlier conditions. Ocean fertilization is an example of carbon dioxide removal. The idea here is by adding small amounts of micronutrients to certain areas of the ocean, it would stimulate algae growth. The algae would basically pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and hopefully some of the algae, when they die, would sink to the deep oceans, essentially serving as a carbon sink. Limited field experiments and computer modeling thus far have suggested, however, that this technique would not be a terribly effective means of sequestering carbon, and it would have all sorts of unpleasant and unfortunate side effects, including the altering of ocean chemistry and marine ecosystems. The other major category of geoengineering, solar radiation management, involve techniques that would not affect greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. That is, those concentrations would continue to rise as we continue to emit greenhouse gases. What these techniques seek to do is to reduce the amount of radiation absorbed by the Earth. So one technique that has received a lot of attention is the release of tiny sulfur particles into the stratosphere. This is one of the most seriously discussed geoengineering proposals because of its seeming technical and economic feasibility. The release of sulfur aerosols could reduce average global temperatures relatively quickly, at least that's what's theorized. And annual estimated costs range from $25 to $50 billion to $200 billion, which experts seem to think isn't a lot of money. Note that these figures do not account for the adverse consequences that might be caused by such a release. That is, these figures basically assume, well, how much would it cost to actually put this stuff up in the stratosphere? In particular, what might those adverse consequences be? Well, they include the possible modification of monsoons in Asia and Africa, which would have severe ramifications on food supplies and obviously on the people there. Like other solar radiation management techniques, release of aerosols also would do nothing to address other problems such as ocean acidification. The acidity of the oceans is rising along with because of the increased concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and solar radiation management techniques would do nothing in this regard. At present, geoengineering proposals are largely theoretical. Little field research has been done, and any of these proposals, if implemented, would be expected to have serious side effects. Although geoengineering development is at a relatively unadvanced stage, there are a number of reasons to initiate governance of geoengineering research and development now. First, momentum to conduct research, including field experiments, is building. One lesson from the development of various technologies, such as genetic engineering, is that the momentum behind unregulated technological development can overwhelm subsequent efforts to incorporate public input or to impose meaningful oversight. Governance efforts before large geoengineering industries and research lobbies have become entrenched are more likely to be effective if started early on. Second, geoengineering poses a somewhat unusual conundrum in that these techniques might potentially be deployed unilaterally. That is, it's a very different dynamic potentially than climate mitigation, where we really do need the cooperation of, if not all the countries, certainly a substantial portion of the international community to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In contrast, geoengineering deployment could occur either through a small group of countries, or even perhaps through an individual country, or perhaps even by private, wealthy individuals who could, in theory, have the resources and develop the technical capacity to carry out these projects, though not necessarily well, carry out these projects on their own. Global governance can safeguard against rogue efforts to engineer the climate without international consensus or approval. Another reason for turning our attention to geoengineering governance is the moral hazard concern that geoengineering may raise. By offering the prospect or mirage of a quick, low-cost, and relatively painless solution to climate change, geoengineering research and development could lead to an unwarranted perception that emissions reductions are unnecessary, and thereby it might undermine the political will, to the extent there is some, supporting mitigation efforts. An additional reason for turning our attention to geoengineering governance is that deciding whether to proceed with geoengineering, and if so how, will be a complicated and difficult process. Geoengineering, by definition, is going to have global implications and will carry potentially catastrophic risks. Its governance should be based on international discussions and widespread public input. That debate must involve more than a simple weighing of risks and benefits. For geoengineering is surrounded by uncertainty and raises thorny ethical questions about its moral permissibility and the obligations that current generations may have to future generations. Let me now turn to my observations and recommendations regarding geoengineering governance. First, if we turn to present mechanisms for geoengineering governance, we see that they are inadequate, or at least they need some further development. Considering existing treaties that might apply, whether the Law of the Sea, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the Treaty on Environmental Modification, none of these treaties was intended to address geoengineering techniques. They offer perhaps a piecemeal approach, a patchwork, with potentially conflicting results and might leave potentially large gaps. When we consider customary law or norms that might apply, we might think of the principle against transboundary harm, as well as the precautionary principle. The exact application of these principles in this context, though, is somewhat uncertain. What exactly would be the trigger for applying these principles, and what exactly would these principles require in the context of geoengineering? For example, does the precautionary principle call for avoiding geoengineering because of its potential hazards, or does the precautionary principle call for going forward with geoengineering because of the climate hazards that threaten? And obviously another difficulty with customary law and norms is that there's no clear mechanism for implementation and enforcement. Despite their limitations, existing treaty regimes can provide a starting point for the development of future governance. Specifically, geoengineering should be addressed within the structure of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Framework Convention states that parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations. This is a premise that certainly could encompass geoengineering governance. The Framework Convention has a regular forum for considering climate-related issues and has at its disposal technical bodies that can facilitate research, peer review, discussion, and development of consensus in this area. Moreover, given the potential substitutability of some types of geoengineering projects for emission reductions, it makes no sense to develop a completely separate regime for addressing geoengineering. A second observation, though, is that both top-down and bottom-up approaches to governance are needed. As we all realize, formal international lawmaking processes can be slow and difficult. Reaching a consensus on geoengineering, perhaps in theory, could be easier than trying to achieve agreement on binding emissions reductions. We don't have to have commitments to vast changes in energy production, economic structures, or individual behavior. And we could try to streamline the process by designing such an agreement as a protocol to the Framework Convention and by structuring discussions to occur among blocks of nations with similar interests. Nonetheless, the potential for values conflict and the interrelationship between any discussions on geoengineering and broader discussions on how we might address climate change through mitigation or adaptation would make such negotiations challenging. At the least, however, an international agreement can establish ground rules for research and provide a forum for resolving conflicts. Because of the difficulty of formal international lawmaking processes, though, it may be helpful to have bottom-up approaches as well. A voluntary code of conduct for geoengineering researchers combined with an informal research governance framework, for instance, would offer a potentially more immediate and flexible governance option. These bottom-up efforts also can lay the groundwork for more formal regulation, but it's doubtful that a bottom-up approach alone will produce effective and accountable mechanisms for assessing and controlling research efforts. First, voluntary efforts tend to generate weak standards. Voluntary cooperation is exactly that, voluntary, and the actors you might most want to subject to some sort of oversight are those that are least likely to volunteer. And third, voluntary efforts tend to lack political legitimacy. Political legitimacy is especially needed to accompany any field tests of geoengineering that could have transboundary effects, but should also be demanded for any geoengineering efforts that could undermine international cooperation on greenhouse gas emission reductions or commit humankind further on a path toward eventual geoengineering deployment. Third, governance of geoengineering cannot rely on a one-size-fits-all approach. Governance should be tailored to reflect the distinctions between different types of geoengineering. They vary greatly in terms of risks and uncertainties. To the extent that geoengineering techniques can serve as substitutes for emission reductions and are not likely to pose significant new risks, existing governance mechanisms might be readily adapted. So, for example, one type of geoengineering, artificial trees, which act sort of like, essentially like carbon scrubbers, might be less problematic than some of the other methods that I've already described. Those methods, ocean fertilization and stratospheric aerosols, for example, pose serious potential for catastrophic harms and unexpected effects, and these sorts of methods ought to be treated with greater caution and be subjected to greater oversight. Let me move on to my last recommendation and observation, which I think warrants a closer look and a little bit more time because of its importance and difficulty. And that is the point that meaningful public participation is necessary for developing a legitimate governance regime. The widespread and potentially life-changing effects of geoengineering demand a more open and participatory process. Yet public participation and consent on an issue like geoengineering are extremely difficult to operationalize. Indeed, global democratic control of geoengineering may be impossible, since there really is no sort of global public that has a shared collective identity, and we don't have political structures that provide for democratic control of international institutions. But the alternative, leaving geoengineering policy to individual nations, would give no voice to those most effective and isn't a satisfactory method either. As a practical matter, though, we can try to foster certain values that I think global governance ought to aim towards. That is, openness, responsiveness, and responsibility. At the very least, valid consent requires formal international consultation and approval. One possibility is to rely on the Conference of the Parties of the Framework Convention on Climate Change as a place to begin. State-to-state discussions in such forums, however, provide only a starting point for deliberation. Steps should be taken to improve the representativeness and deliberativeness of international bodies and organizations that craft geoengineering policy. In particular, transparency in state-to-state deliberations and decision-making promotes accountability and is a necessary condition for informed public debate. Official meetings, as well as informal discussions at which important decisions are made, should be open to outside observers and made available to the public. And transparency should extend to research projects that are undertaken and to resulting data and analysis. In addition, efforts need to be made to engage the public actively in the geoengineering debate. We might try methods such as public awareness campaigns, national referenda, and other efforts to promote discussion in concrete or electronic public forums. Now, the prospect of involving hundreds of millions of people or billions of people worldwide in some sort of participatory exercise in democratic governance isn't really a practical one. But democratic governance is not merely concerned with trying to aggregate individual preferences. It ought to be concerned with reasoned and informed deliberation. That's what ultimately we need to try to promote, and global governance institutions should be designed to that effect. Non-governmental organizations, community organizations, labor unions, and other civil society organizations have a critical role to play in this process. Typically, these organizations have not directly crafted the text of international agreements, with some exceptions, but they have helped to frame issues, set agendas, develop policy options, shape official state positions, and monitor state commitments. Civil society organizations, in other words, can function as pluralistic intermediaries between international legal regimes and the publics the regimes ultimately govern. Note that they operate in two directions. One, to channel citizen views into formal deliberative processes, and two, to make formal processes more transparent and accessible to citizens. With respect to geoengineering, the active participation of civil society organizations can be an important avenue for presenting alternative views, for raising overlooked concerns, and for promoting transparency. Acting like ombudsmen, civil society organizations should be permitted to raise concerns directly to policymakers and to demand public responses to those concerns. For example, if the approval of geoengineering research projects is ultimately entrusted to a review board, the board should be required to respond to questions from civil society organizations and to publicly explain its decisions. Requiring public justification not only facilitates external evaluation of specific actions, but also fosters institutional legitimacy. Finally, partnerships between non-governmental organizations in the North and the South can empower the public in developing countries whose views might otherwise be overlooked. In conclusion, geoengineering presents difficult political, ethical, and technical challenges for humankind. Establishing governance structures to oversee any geoengineering field research or deployment is essential.
Mr. Lynn, thank you very much for that presentation. So next up, we will have Professor Will Burns. So let's welcome Professor Burns.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for coming. Your expectations on, the 4th of July and the afternoon of the conference are so low that this far exceeds it. So thank you for coming. Thought we might be speaking to no one. Al set the table well for here, so I want to feed off of some of his things at the outset. In dividing geoengineering between carbon dioxide removal techniques and solar radiation management techniques, while both of these strategies might be deployed in the future, in my mind, solar radiation management strategies are the one that are far likely to be front and center in the future for a number of reasons. First of all, as Al's pointed out, the poster child of carbon dioxide removal, which is ocean iron fertilization, has proven to be pretty unavailing. And some of the other techniques, such as artificial trees, appear to be cost exorbitant. On the other hand, solar radiation management, as he indicated, appears to be relatively cheap to do. You can deploy it very quickly, and its impacts, assuming arguendo that it's effective, would happen very quickly. And so I think that techniques such as seeding of clouds to increase their albedo or reflectivity and sulfur injection into the atmosphere are the most likely techniques that are going to be used in the future. And as Al indicated, a lot of the emphasis in looking at potential negative side effects to date have focused on intragenerational impacts. They've looked at what may happen in other parts of the world. As Al has already indicated, for example, sulfur injection into the atmosphere as well as cloud seeding could substantially decrease evaporation and in turn decrease precipitation, and it could wreak havoc with monsoons in areas such as Southeast Asia. Similarly, cloud seeding could result in substantial declines and huge diebacks in the Amazonian forests in terms of trees, which would create a massive positive feedback mechanism in terms of carbon releases. However, I would argue that some of the most serious impacts related to solar radiation management are in the context of what may happen to future generations should we deploy it. And that's what my focus will be here. The potential impacts of solar radiation management in terms of future generations and the potential role of international law in addressing those issues. And more specifically, the potential role of intergenerational equity in determining whether we can deploy these techniques in an ethical and justifiable manner. And in developing this argument, I'd like to look at several things. First of all, the potential threats that solar radiation management may pose to future generations. Second of all, the implications of this in the context of the international legal principle of intergenerational equity. And third of all, countering the argument that deployment of geoengineering is actually a way to fulfill our obligations to future generations. So first of all, in terms of the potential impacts that solar radiation management could have on future generations, the most serious of these impacts is something that we call the termination effect or the rebound effect. And what the termination effect is the potential for a huge multi-decadal pulse of warming that would occur after a geoengineering strategy such as sulfur injection or cloud seeding would either fail or would be there would be a conscious decision to simply cease its use. Okay? In terms of the first, one of these technologies could fail. Okay? Take sulfur injection, for example. Beyond the possibility of technological failures in terms of the way we deliver sulfur injections, it's also possible that the albedo properties, the ability of sulfur particles to reflect incoming solar radiation, would be altered by the changes in atmosphere that would occur as a consequence of even doing this. Okay? It would be a feedback mechanism that would ultimately denude the effectiveness of that technique, and it might ultimately no longer be effective, okay? Or second of all, countries could decide we can't do this any longer, okay? If for some reason countries like India, for some reason, felt angry by the fact that you had shut down their monsoon and imperiled billions of people, they might threaten the world with nuclear war. And as a consequence, one might have to cease the use of solar radiation management. What would happen if we were to suddenly pull the plug on one of those techniques? Well, all of the buildup of carbon dioxide that might have occurred during that time would now manifest itself, and manifest itself very quickly. Second of all, you would have positive feedback mechanisms associated with this phenomena that had been masked for decades or longer that would now manifest themselves. And what would be the implications? First of all, it's been estimated by several recent studies that the rate of warming for the first 3 decades after we ceased using a solar radiation technique, the rate of warming would be approximately 20 times a business as usual scenario. So for example, we are currently seeing temperatures increase somewhere around 0.2 degrees per decade. It's been estimated that we would see temperatures in the tropics in the course of the next 30 years after we cease the use of a solar radiation technique increase by about 7 degrees Celsius. Similarly, in the Arctic, we could see temperature increases of 6 to 10 degrees Celsius over the course of 30 years, and northern land masses could see increases of 6 degrees Celsius in the summer. To put this in perspective, projected temperature increases after termination would occur more rapidly than the most extreme and abrupt global warming event in the history of man, which was the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which wreaked havoc and resulted in the loss of 50 to 60% of the species on Earth. The temperature increases that we would see during this time would be greater than we had seen during that period of time. It's beyond contention that these kind of impacts are obviously serious. Should temperatures increase at a rate of only 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade, only 30% of all impacted ecosystems and 17% of all impacted forests would likely be able to adapt. And yet with solar radiation termination, we're looking at temperature increases potentially 13 times greater than that. Beyond the termination effect, there could also be serious implications for recovery of the Earth's stratospheric ozone layer from the most widely advocated SRM approach, which is atmospheric sulfate injection. Anthropogenic ozone-depleting substances, as we know, chlorofluorocarbons, resulted in massive impacts in terms of the world, in terms of cancer rates, impacts on ecosystems, oceans, etc. At the same time, the efforts of the Montreal Protocol are ultimately going to result in replenishment of the ozone layer, perhaps by 2040 to 2050. However, if we were to deploy solar radiation management techniques, most specifically sulfur injection, it would produce a huge new strata for the chemical processes that break down the ozone layer to accelerate. As a consequence, it's been estimated that over the course of the next 10 to 20 years after deployment of such a technique, we would see global annual losses of the ozone column of 4.5% annually, which is more than the annual global mean decreases associated with these substances in the early part of this century. As a consequence, instead of the ozone layer recovering by 2040 to 2050, it might delay this recovery by as much as 60 to 70 additional years, subjecting future generations to all of the negative impacts that we're talking about as a consequence of this loss. Of course, the termination effect, at least that we're talking about, could be averted if countries were to simultaneously engage in substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions while they deployed these solar radiation management techniques. However, there's a very serious risk that deployment of these technologies would constitute a moral hazard. That is, that there would be a substantial reduction in commitment by the world to reducing emissions, since geoengineering could substantially undercut incentives to confront climate change by this generation. There's empirical evidence of moral hazard behavior in the context of insurance, where newly insured parties are more inclined to take risky behavior than previously because compensation is available. Moreover, in the context of climate change policy making, there's ample concern in terms of moral hazard behavior. Several studies have indicated that SRM options would be extremely cheap. By contrast, mitigating and adapting to climate change would be extremely expensive. This would put pressure on policymakers to take the quick fix and to funnel those resources in other areas. Moreover, a technological fix such as solar radiation management would not require changes in lifestyle. And as a consequence, it would probably be substantial public support for simply utilizing that quick fix and only giving lip service to mitigating, meaning that our largely feckless efforts to mitigate at this point would be laid even lower in the future. Now, what does SRM mean in the context of intergenerational equity? First of all, as most of you probably know, intergenerational equity is a principle of distributive justice. It calls for fairness in the utilization of resources between human generations, past, present, and in the future. Various rationale exists for the principle of intergenerational equity. For example, from a social contract perspective, we can argue that all generations are partners in an open-ended social contract, which defines their rights, their duties, and their obligations. Another rationale is the notion of unjust enrichment. Our generation is, of course, indebted to past generations for endowing us with resources that ensure our well-being. From an equitable standpoint, it can be argued that we hold these resources in trust and have a responsibility to pass them on in no worse condition than we received them to future generations. Finally, intergenerational equity can be viewed as an extension of the public trust doctrine, mandating that this generation protect the interests of future generations in the Earth and its resources. As developed by Professor Edith Brown Weiss, one of its primary proponents, intergenerational equity provides for three principal obligations to future generations: a conservation of their options, a conservation of the quality of the environment, and a conservation of access to resources. Intergenerational equity is a binding principle of international law with broad application. Most pertinent in the context of climate change policy, of course, is the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And Article 3.1 provides clearly that the parties should protect the climate system both for the benefit of the present generations and future generations on the basis of equity. Most notably, this is one of the few international legal instruments that includes an international generational equity requirement, not in the preambular or softer language, but actually in a specific provision of the treaty, giving it further binding effect. Additionally, it could be argued that intergenerational equity now constitutes customary international law. First, the principle has been incorporated into many treaties that have almost universal acceptance. For example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, the Convention on Migratory Species, the Convention on Conservation of European Wildlife and Natural Habitats. Moreover, if one looks at the UN Charter, it also provides for protection of the interests of future generations. Additionally, from the standpoint of development of customary international law, the principle has been incorporated in the constitutions of many countries, including all of the following. And finally, many courts at both the international and domestic level have applied the principle, and the principle has been incorporated widely into many soft law instruments, especially in the context of sustainable development. I would argue that deployment of an SRM scheme of the kind that we've described would violate the principle of intergenerational equity, and more specifically, the attendant obligations that have been developed by Professor Brown Weiss in operationalizing intergenerational equity for future generations. As indicated above, a future generation would face the grave implications of the termination effect if an SRM scheme were to fail. This would contravene the second obligation of intergenerational equity that's outlined by Weiss. That is conservation of quality. Because the failure of our generation to substantially reduce our greenhouse gas emissions would result in a greatly degraded planetary conditions for future generations under such a scenario if SRM technology was ever terminated. This argument would also apply in terms of the potential negative impacts on the ozone layer that we described above. Alternatively, even if future generations weren't compelled to forgo or terminate deployment of an SRM scheme, it could be argued that it would be judicious to do so on policy or ethical grounds, as we indicated, because of the potential negative side effects that would occur, especially for some of the most vulnerable people in the world. For example, as indicated earlier, atmospheric sulfur dioxide injection could result in adverse regional impacts on precipitation, undermining the livelihoods of inhabitants in Africa and Asia. Also, deployment of another SRM scheme, marine cloud seeding, could also result in severe negative impacts. While our generation might deem such collateral effects acceptable, A future generation might not, especially if regional impacts were exacerbated by other factors, such as rising populations or declines in food production attributable to other causes, or if affected states were to threaten war. However, future leaders might feel that their hands were tied, given the potentially catastrophic global implications of suspending the use of SRM technologies. In short, SRM would become a sword of Damocles for those generations, for not just 50 years, but it's been estimated for at least 300 to 400 years in the future. Indeed, some of the proponents of geoengineering even tout the threat of the rebound effect as a way to, quote, ensure policy continuity in the future. I believe that placing a future generation, or many future generations, on the horns of such a moral dilemma would violate the first obligation of intergenerational equity outlined by Professor Brown-Weiss, which is conservation of options, because it would severely circumscribe future generations' ability to make policies that reflect their values and options to address climate change that they deem to be most effective and most equitable. So finally, let's look at the flip side of this. As Al has already suggested, some people argue that you can look at some certain principle of international environmental law as justifying geoengineering's use or not justifying them. And his example was the precautionary principle. Then this is another one. Some proponents of geoengineering argue that to operationalize our obligations to future generations to protect them, that we have a moral obligation, indeed, to currently research geoengineering techniques and probably deploy them. Okay. I would suggest that argument it looks at only two possible options, and two very stark options. One is that we proceed with our business as usual emissions in terms of greenhouse gases, or two, that we deploy geoengineering to try to save ourselves from our folly. However, there's a third a third possible option, which is to actually substantially mitigate greenhouse gas emissions over the course of the next 50 years. Recent studies, including one by the International Energy Agency, provide us with a path to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions at 450 parts per million at a cost that is either revenue neutral or is actually advantageous in the long term. To the extent that society has an option, this current generation has an option that would not wreak economic havoc, I would argue that it has a moral obligation to take that path instead of taking us down a path that potentially in the future could condemn generations to being compelled to maintain a system that they morally feel should not be maintained, or which could potentially fail and potentially devastate ecosystems in the future. Some proponents of geoengineering, however, argue that even if we have measures that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the future, we're reaching critical thresholds that mean that we have to act very quickly. And as a consequence, they argue that geoengineering, if at the very least, is a bridge that gives us some time, buys us time while society gets its collective act together in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, here, I would also argue that we should focus on implementing other measures that would accomplish this same purpose while not potentially visiting the harms of geoengineering on future generations. For example, according to a very recently released UNEP report, implementing measures known to be effective against two short-lived atmospheric pollutants, black carbon and ground-level ozone, over the next 20 years would have immediate and multiple benefits. Among these would be a reduction of temperatures between 0.2 degrees Celsius and 0.7 degrees Celsius by the year 2050. These measures would also result in a co-benefit of having between 0.7 and 4.6 million lives being saved as a result of improved air quality issues. This would provide us the bridge and the breathing room to look at substantive measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions without having to use the alternative of geoengineering. Some proponents of geoengineering would also argue that it would be acceptable to deploy it if we were also to agree to a strict schedule to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions simultaneously, obviating any of the potential parade of horribles that I've talked about above. However, it's difficult to be sanguine about the prospects of such an agreement. If the world at the current time is not willing to substantially reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, even in the face of the horrific consequences of climate change that may occur in the future, why would it be more likely to do so in the future when it has a get-out-of-jail card in the guise of climate geoengineering? It's not terribly likely. Second of all, I think it's questionable whether we even have a mechanism to substantively regulate geoengineering at this point. The most logical regime would be the Framework Convention on Climate Change. However, if you look at the Framework Convention itself, while it does have the language that Al indicated, which is to protect the climate, if you look at the substantive measures that it calls on to protect the climate, they all focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Solar radiation management doesn't do that. It doesn't seek to reduce emissions. It seeks to reduce the incoming solar radiation so that the impacts of those emissions are ameliorated. To that extent, I'd argue that it's questionable that the Framework Convention would even have jurisdiction over solar radiation management techniques. So it's questionable that we actually have a regime that could negotiate a simultaneous reduction in emissions as a quid pro quo for deployment of geoengineering. It's more likely that we'll have unilateral or bilateral deployment of geoengineering without that simultaneous agreement. And as a consequence, the sword of Damocles that we talked about in the future is a realistic specter. In conclusion, what I would argue is that in looking at geoengineering and more specifically solar radiation management, it's important that we both heed the voices of this generation and future generations in terms of what implications these kind of decisions may have. To the extent that these implications are incredibly severe, I would argue that we should look at them through the lens of intergenerational equity and look extremely seriously at the implications of what a technological fix to problems that have been beget by current technologies may visit on future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Burns, for that very sobering presentation on why it is that geoengineering is not the silver bullet that's going to save us all. So next we sort of widen the lens, and we have Professor Floor Flurka. Professor Flurka, let's give Professor Flurka a warm welcome.
Thank you. First of all, many thanks for this opportunity to present our paper here. As we have seen the last week, the very... Oh, sorry. I have to... How do I get better, please? Oh, okay. Okay, sorry for that. As we have seen this last week, we saw some very interesting papers. And in fact, the papers that were presented provide a perfect backdrop for our argument. And our argument is that if we are facing environmental crisis, regulators will promote regulatory effectiveness as their single most important goal. And that means that considerations regarding regulatory legitimacy will not have much weight, as all that matters is averting ecological crisis. So shortly on the organization of this talk, first I will clarify some important concepts that will support our argument. Then I will pay a little bit attention to a possible obstacle for the pursuit of effectiveness, namely the ethics that we are currently using. This ethics is very much anthropocentric and individualistic approach, and that might undermine effectiveness. And we will see if possibly an alternative ethics presented by Hans Jonas can make a difference. Then we will look at the use of technology as a response to environmental crisis. We will then, my colleague Jonathan will turn to the example of geoengineering and look at it from an international law context. And we will end with some conclusions. First, some important concepts. We are focusing here on man-made disasters. We're not looking at natural disasters because we presume that we cannot prevent those from happening. We also look at unintentional and both unintentional man-made acts. What is then further important as a premise is that we adopt a very simple perspective of what we expect from our regulators. That is first, that they should be effective. And that is just simply purpose for fit. So what they should do is should be effective. It should also be legitimate. They should do the right thing and use the right instruments. And these two concepts are in fact interconnected. So if it were not for the fundamental guarantees of legitimacy, the sole purpose of regulators would just be effectiveness. And we think that in order to avert environmental crisis, regulatory priorities must and will tilt much more towards effectiveness, and this at the expense of legitimacy. So if we then look at the ethics that we are currently using, we see, as I already said, that this is very much anthropocentric of approach. So no regard has been made to future generations and hardly to ecological values. Hans Jonas offers an alternative for this. His view is that we should not pursue the good life, but we should aim for the survival of mankind as a whole. So his view is then that we should pursue this echte leven, and in this case he looks at precaution as a means to that. So you should presume the worst to happen, and precaution could help by trying to save mankind. He also says there's no first-hand hostility against technology in order to pursue this goal. How should we do this? Faced with environmental crisis, regulators must find a way to engage with the general public in a way that will radically change behavior, because it's usually this day-to-day use of the public that is causing the ecological crisis. So we should engage with them. But it's likely that this public will resist regulatory intervention in their chosen way of life. Regulators will want to go on about their business in such a way that non-compliance is either no option or triggers automatic detection and punishment. And since there is a high degree of scientific certainty about the effect of those activities, the regulators are put in a moral strong position to act in such a way. So it's likely that such regulators will more and more focus on the use of technology. And what is so attractive about using technology as a regulatory instrument is that it does not seek to engage with regulators, but simply imposes a norm that has been embedded in a technology. Most famous example is speed trams or bumps. You can use just command and control and put a police officer there, but you can also just use a huge speed bump that will break your car. So other examples are speed restrictions built into wired cars, which has been developed right now. emission controls that shut down industrial plants, etc. And then deviation from this is just not possible. It's important to make a distinction between omnipresent surveillance techniques, where deviation is always detected, so you can deviate, but it is detected, or absolute preclusion, where it's not even possible to deviate. But of course, this translates in differences in ways in which a regulatory approach based on the use of technology can impact on an agent's choice and possible differences in moral acceptability. I will discuss this later. What I've just discussed is based on the work of Loris Lessig. He has written a very good book on this, Code. And currently this technology as a regulation, as a regulatory instrument, is not in use in environmental law. But we have a pretty successful use of what I call first generation environmental technology. We use environmental product standards, we use environmental process standards, satellite surveillance, and even terminator technologies that are really quite successful. So it's not new to use technology as a regulatory instrument. However, the second generation environmental technologies is a little bit different, but the success of the first generation may well pave the way for this second generation of environmental technologies. So increasingly states have access to technologies of surveillance that are so sophisticated and reliable that where an environmental offense is committed, the offending agent will always be detected. The fact that all offenses will be observed, all offenders detected, might be cause of moral concern. Of course, we want to have power over our own will, right? So if we are always under the threat of being detected, that has consequences for our moral community. This is even more problematic for so-called techno-regulation, where the preclusionary regulation, where it is simply not possible to do X. So where, as a surveillance technology, you could do X, but you will be detected, in this new form of techno-regulation, it's not even possible. So what is very problematic about this is that agents are excluded from the discourse and debate of regulatory standard setting, which is very important, especially in environmental law. Like Professor Jans this morning discussed, Aarhus Convention is very important from a legitimacy perspective. Also, technology can take over the role of our moral community from a more philosophical perspective. So, what is very problematic now is what we should do. Should we use technology to avert risks that are caused by technology? So, Posner has formulated this dilemma very well. I think he says, the contribution technology can make to averting both natural and man-made catastrophes, including the man-made catastrophes that technology itself enables or accelerates. So we now turn to the example of geoengineering, and I will give the floor to Jonathan.
Geoengineering is typically a technology aimed at averting environmental catastrophe, as we just heard, without interfering the behavior of individual citizens. So I think it's a nice example. So what did we do? We first looked at current international law, and I also must stress that We have been working on developing this more theoretical background, and now we're just at the beginning of applying it to specific cases. So it's just a first attempt to apply these ideas on this topic. So we first wanted to have a look at current international law. What kind of norms exist that provide for maybe for legitimacy in this when applying this new technology. And we looked at 4 categories: customary international law, human rights, conventions that explicitly deal with geoengineering, and conventions that do not explicitly deal with geoengineering but may be applicable. And I will very briefly go into these because there's a lot to say about all of these sources. First of all, customary international law. Of course, well, some of the things have already been mentioned in the previous 2 presentations. The no harm principle, of course, is a very important principle which applies here as explained by the International Court of Justice in both the Danube Dam case and the pulp mills case, which shows that the prevention principle is a part of it, a very important part of it. An environmental impact assessment has to be carried out with participation of interested population. There has to be continuous monitoring of the impact, and precaution has to be applied. Although the court doesn't call it a principle, precaution is there in these cases as well. So these are kind of conditions that apply to deploying these new technologies, including geoengineering. Intergenerational activity is another one, but I will not go into that much more because we already heard a lot about that as well. Again, I must stress that you can apply both the precautionary principle and the principle of intergenerational activity in both directions, both in favor or against geoengineering. But that makes things a little bit complex, and it limits, it shows the limitations of international law as a means of setting conditions. Maybe before I go to the next one, a little bit about human rights. There's scarce literature on the role of human rights in geoengineering. Just a few not so good publications written either by proponents of geoengineering or people who are against it. So you can go in either direction. I just want to again say here that especially procedural rights seem to be important here. So access to information, public participation, and access to justice. Then conventions that deal with geoengineering. Well, as already was said before, there is not a specific convention that was drafted because of geoengineering, because it doesn't exist yet. However, the ENMOD Convention, the Environmental Modifications Convention from 1976, I think explicitly deals with geoengineering, because in Article 1, the term environmental modification techniques, and that's what this convention is all about, is defined as follows: any technique for changing, through the deliberate manipulation of natural processes, the dynamics, composition, or structure of the Earth, including its biota, lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere or outer space. So this definition clearly applies, I think, to geoengineering. So this convention, I think, would apply here. As you can see of its title, its name, it's on military and hostile use. So most authors simply say, okay, this is not relevant because it's about military use. However, Article 3, and you can also see that from the preamble, Article 3 deals with environmental modification techniques for peaceful purposes. So there's a specific article dealing with peaceful application of environmental modifications. And Article 3 then gives conditions, requirements that have to be in place when modification techniques are used for peaceful purposes. And I've listed those conditions there. So cooperation is needed. You cannot deploy geoengineering or in the terminology of the Convention of Modification Techniques, you cannot deploy it on your own account. So one state cannot do that, it's not allowed under this convention. You have to contribute, you have to cooperate, and you have to contribute to international economic and scientific cooperation, protect the environment, and you have to take into account the needs of developing countries. So there's a set of criteria that has to be, I think, applied. However, one important thing that has to be noted, of course, is that this convention only applies to countries or states that signed and ratified this treaty. Yeah? So if you go to a state that is not a party, then all of this does not apply. Well, other conventions that explicitly deal with geoengineering are the CBD, Convention about Diversity. Of course, it's not in the convention itself, but the parties adopted a resolution against geoengineering in general. Same goes for the London Dumping Convention and 1996 Protocol, specifically targeting ocean fertilization. Although even from these resolutions you can draw some conditions that have apparently are considered to be important, like transparency, like impact assessment, precautionary principle. All these things are in these resolutions. And UNFCCC was also mentioned. No explicit decisions are taken there, but you can argue that it applies. I think we just heard the argument that it does not apply because it's about mitigation and adaptation, and this is something else. I think you can also defend the argument that it's about climate change and not about mitigation and adaptation alone. So, but there's a possible discussion there. And then there are some conventions that may apply depending on the kind of technique that is used. Convention on long-range disrupting air pollution, Vienna Convention on the ozone layer, our Space Convention. I highlighted that one because I want to go into that into a little bit more detail. One of the techniques that I didn't hear yet in the previous presentations is deployment of mirrors in space that to reflect solar radiation. And that, of course, falls under the scope of the Outer Space Convention. And that's, I think, interesting because that introduces two new conditions or two new criteria: liability for damage. So if you cause damage because of this of deploying these new technologies, then you're liable. And state responsibility for actions by private actors. And that's important because, as Professor Lin already said in the first presentation, an individual actor, wealthy person, can deploy these techniques personally. And under this convention, they have thought of a way to deal with that, namely that the state from which the deployment into outer space originates is responsible for the actions. But that's a way to deal with it. And then we have UNCLOS, North Sea Convention, and OSPAR. And again, these conventions have some more procedural conditions for ocean fertilization. So where does this first overview of current international law brings us? First of all, I think the conclusion is that technology as a regulatory instrument is becoming increasingly important. Its role is growing, and as its effectiveness seems to be very strong, and since politicians are really aimed now at or focused on being effective, this may only increase. Questions about legitimacy are raised. Well, I think we will have a discussion about that. I think that the previous discussions clearly raised all the issues. I think that current international law already gives some kind of conditions that helps to bring legitimacy to geoengineering. First of all, the procedural conditions that I just showed you from various conventions. And I think the big question is, do we need more conditions? Do we need more, maybe even more substantive requirements to limit the discussion and development and application, deployment of geoengineering or other technologies? So that's, I think, a big issue for the next future, things that we have to discuss. We would like to do that by also targeting other technologies and researching this from a similar framework, from a similar point of view. So maybe GMOs, nanotechnology, and I think it's interesting to draw conclusions from the various technologies and see if we can develop some kind of framework which contributes to a greater legitimacy when deploying or developing and deploying new technologies. That's what I'd like to say.
Well, Thank you very much, Professor Flurka and Professor Vescuren. That was very nice. If the panelists would mind coming up so we could have the discussion portion up here. I think we have four of you. And I'm very proud of the fact that this panel is right on time and we'll have plenty of time for discussion. I take great pride in that. But if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to start the discussion with a question, and because I'm the moderator, I'm going to use that privilege and go ahead and put a question that I'd like each of the panelists to address it. And of course, the question has to start with a few assumptions, or I would not be a lawyer. So assuming that we fail, the world fails to mitigate greenhouse gases, and assuming during that time that a solar radiation modification technology is developed that can be employed, and then finally assuming the world does agree the default position is going to be nobody employs this until we say so. So I think the ultimate question, at least in my mind, is what would be the trigger to say it's time to employ geoengineering? I can think of a lot of different ways. Is it a certain level of CO2? But would we then just be exchanging one unknown risk based on a model for another unknown risk based on a model? Would it be a well-developed risk assessment? Would it be just majority rules or supermajority rules as far as yes, we should employ it or no, we shouldn't? Or would it require unanimity? And I guess the last, one that came to mind is, because regulations often don't happen until there's a catastrophe, would it require, a catastrophe where we might as well employ it now because we no longer have a risk of climate change. We have catastrophe on our hands, so we might as well. So I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on what that trigger to say, yes, we should employ should look like.
Well, I guess I'll start. I'm not sure I'm going to provide a satisfactory answer, but obviously there's a lot packed into that set of questions, and I think I would focus more on the rules. That is, I'm not sure I'm in the position to say what, or whether it really matters what I think the trigger ultimately ought to be personally. I really do think that this is a question that really does need to be debated and debated extensively, involving not just a few academics in a room or even a few world leaders, but really needs to get some serious public contention. And so that's kind of the thrust of what I'm pushing for is opening up the debate and airing these issues out, and at the same time realizing that we will have these we potentially could have these very hard decisions to make. And I think it's incumbent to begin looking at that now before we're at whatever point some people might think it is, right? I mean, it could be whenever we get to one of these carbon levels, or we have some sort of disaster. And the whole disaster scenario is one of the arguments that's sometimes made for geoengineering, is that, well, we'll save it in case of a disaster or to ward off a disaster. And I think one of the dangers is not knowing exactly what that trigger point is. So I think it is important to look at this question of, well, what exactly is going to be the decision-making mechanism for moving forward with this. But that's my way of saying I don't know.
Hoping you're not expecting anything much more substantive. I mean, the trigger points that are talked about most of the time are runaway loss of ice masses. If you reach 3 degrees Celsius, temperature increases, and you start you initiate the loss of the Greenland ice sheets, and you get 7 meters of sea level rise. Right, it's lights out for large parts of the world. So that's one that's talked about. 3 degrees Celsius, you're talking about the loss of most coral reefs. You're talking about maybe shutting down the thermohaline circulation belt and sending Europe into an ice age, paradoxically, in the long term, right? Those are all thresholds that people talk about and that proponents use for geoengineering. So I think you could achieve a consensus fairly reasonably in terms of triggers. But the larger question is, what I don't like about that approach is it bakes in the assumption that that's inevitable and makes it more inevitable that we proceed down that path. And I may be looking at a world that doesn't exist, but I don't want to get to that point. I don't think it's a Manichaean choice. And as I said, there are ways for us to buy some time that mean that we're not likely to pass those thresholds for probably at least 40 or 50 years if we work aggressively. And there are no regrets options. So I don't worry about the triggers. Risk assessment is clearly something we need. One of the real problems that we have with risk assessment in the context of climate geoengineering is that that risk assessment has to take place over a long period of time, and you have to have virtual full deployment of many of these techniques to be able to realistically do risk assessment. Lab experiments are not going to tell you what full-scale deployment of sulfur injection in the atmosphere will do, or albedo modification via clouds. Ocean iron fertilization is a perfect example of this. It's been estimated that because of the signal-to-noise ratio, because of the natural variability of the ocean climates, that if you were to deploy even large-scale ocean iron fertilization, it would probably be at least a decade before you could separate the signal-to-noise ratio. And by that time, you could visit catastrophic and irreversible ecosystem impacts. So your risk assessment results in the ultimate demise of large portions of the ocean. So risk assessment is problematic in the context of climate geoengineering under the best of circumstances. And how it's going to be done, I mean, I don't see us ever mandating a risk assessment process where everybody gets a veto, right? We don't even have that with really strong risk assessment processes like NEPA, right? NEPA's not substantive, right? You can do the risk assessment and say, yeah, it's gonna do some really bad crap, but we're doing it anyway, right? I mean, I can't believe that the world is going to develop a more substantive sort of approach, right? If a country thinks that it's screwed by climate impacts, it's going to deploy and it's going to give lip service to risk assessment. It's going to let others provide input, but it's going to do what's in its own best interest, in my mind. It's my limited regard and respect for international law, perhaps, but nonetheless, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I think that the principle that pops up most often in this discussion is the precautionary principle, and that I think implies that research is needed so that we know more about the potential risks. But that, when you enter all the problems that we just discussed, you need to have tests in order to get more information, and those tests are dangerous in themselves. So that also is an interesting debate. Should we regulate then research already at the moment? Because research is being done at the moment. There are some first guidelines, specifically under the London Convention, but it's very small. And yeah, it's really the question whether that's enough. So that's, I think, one way to work in. So can we set boundaries for scientists to do research so that we can increase our knowledge of all problems involved? Another, I think, element that's really important that shows from our research that to be important is cooperation. This is something that needs to be discussed by the international community because it involves all countries. And all these conventions, they all are about cooperation, transparency. So this is something that has to be done by the international community as a whole. Now, that again is a very difficult thing to do because people who live in small island states or in Bangladesh have completely different view on geoengineering than people who are safe and sound in areas that will not have a big impact. So internationally, I think this is also an extremely difficult topic to approach. But I still think that these are the two ways forward. So first, the research community has to have a discussion not only with itself but with the broader public as well. And the international community has to pick it up. And I think under the UNFCCC umbrella, because that's most suited.
Yes, I was also thinking in the direction of the precautionary principle, but we already discussed that the precautionary principle can go two ways. It can argue in favor or against. So basically you come down to risk trade-off discussion. And what is then the best way forward is that I think that you should simply try to figure out what decision is will cause the most disastrous consequences. But that is only one question further. So you will also have a need to who's going to decide that then. So my instinct is that the scientists should take the lead there, and that also scientists should also apply precaution in their risk assessment. So they should, in an early phase, already look at alternatives and look at uncertainties. And so they shouldn't have all the answers in the risk assessment. They should be able to take a precautionary approach also in their risk assessment. And by that risk assessment, they can then advise the risk managers, who are, of course, responsible in the end. And then I think that you can, as a risk manager, you should also have some kind of philosophical point of view. And then I think you should aim for, like I said in my presentation, for the philosophy of Hans Jonas. And that is putting the survival of mankind as your primary goal, instead of what is done currently, and that is short-term objectives, pursuing a good life. So I think that is my answer for now.
Well, thank you all very, very much. So now questions from you all.
So many questions. It's hard to pick where to start. Let me start with a wonky one, perhaps, then. This is for all of you at the same time, and whoever would like to take it first, please jump in. Most of the interesting challenge in looking at solar radiation management approaches is that, as Will said, it's Manichaean. You tend to do it as all or nothing with global scale. Some of the most recent research is focused on regional climate modification, focusing particularly, say, for example, in the Arctic, where you have particularly sensitive systems that might deserve protection early. If you were able to target geoengineering to an area, does that change in a fundamental way your analysis, in that you may not potentially have an international legal obligation to consult perhaps with the entire community of nations? I know it's a good question, but no one wants to answer it first.
Well, I'm not convinced that you could, develop a method that would confine its results to a national boundary. I mean, if we take the example of the Arctic, which is the one that's talked about, I mean, I'm not sure the research actually supports, the modeling supports confining those results to the Arctic. And the Arctic, of course, is not an area subject to single national jurisdiction. So I'm, very skeptical of the premise. I mean, I suppose if you knew for sure that you could confine it to a national boundary, then I think a lot of the difficulties would go away. But I think all the panelists here would agree that those difficulties aren't going to go away. We're still going to have uncertainty, huge amounts of uncertainty, because it's going to be so difficult to do the tests.
Yeah, when I look at credible researchers in this context, the person I turn to mostly is Ken Caldera at Stanford, and he's looked at this regional approach and he's extremely skeptical that we could cabinet it. If we could, I think that's potentially an answer. And another thing that we've talked about is a couple of people, Wood and some of the researchers at Carnegie Mellon have talked about deploying sulfur injection at lower levels that essentially would only buy us substantive time if we had a set metric for simultaneously reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that it would be overwhelmed by kind of a date certain in the future. So it reduces the potential for the moral hazard. I think that, as opposed to kind of a full hangout sort of approach with geoengineering, would be much more palatable. But again, it assumes, you know, high levels of international cooperation that seem to be belied by you know, our track record to date in terms of climate change.
Well, this is really fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I guess I have a question for you, Will. Glad to have you here. Are we already in a rebound? Statistically, we've shut down lots of coal-fired power plants here. And in China, in fact, if they're not shutting down plants, they are at least looking to they're shutting down the dirtiest plants. So there's less SO2 building up in the air. We have reduced our SO2 in the United States far beyond the target that Counteracting was looking at, and reduction is down so far that now emissions allowances are going for like $6 a ton, and there are even bids in the 56 cents a ton level. So, do we have any data now from in terms of the rebound now?
There is some data, and they indicate that if the Chinese, the Indians, Indonesians, Brazilians, the large emitters, were to implement measures that were commensurate with the Clean Air Act, which has resulted in a lot of this rebound, that you're probably looking at altering temperatures by about 1 degree Celsius. But when you're looking at the rebound effect, you're talking about, you know, 7 degrees in 30 years, right? And this is more like 1. So it certainly does have some impact, but it doesn't have the kind of impact that a full shutdown of one of these systems would have after, you know, deployment for a few decades.
And as a follow-up, it would seem to me that as you're trying to offset more and more greenhouse gases, you need to put more and more sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to reflect more and more light, so that the sky will look like this permanently. How much more do you have to put up there, and what kind of health effects is it to hold in, you know, a 7 degree rebound from happening?
Yeah.
I mean, you'd need seems like a hell of a lot of. We'd have to go back to only burning coal.
Yeah, that's right.
Just to get the SO2.
Yeah, that's another lock-in that would happen for future generations. Yeah, it's true. No one's certain, but there would have to be an escalation. I mean, some people argue, some of the proponents argue that very recognition would ultimately result in galvanizing people to really work on mitigation. Right? I don't know if they're doing that tongue-in-cheek or if they really believe that. You know. Yeah, I mean, the other crazy argument I hear is that this is so scary that we should talk more about it because it will galvanize people into reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You know, but you would have to substantially escalate your sulfur load, and that would not be without negative impacts in terms of ambient sulfur dioxide levels in the troposphere, ultimately, because it drops. Even if you were to deploy enough to offset a scenario of 2 times pre-industrial levels concentrations of CO2, you're going to increase your SO2 load in the troposphere ultimately by about somewhere between 11 and 18%, right? And that certainly has impact also, you know. So, you know, there's no free lunch, right?
Other questions? Okay, well, if there's no other questions, let's please give a round of applause.